of our study camp. And some of us who are feeling the nip of winter here in Chennai at least, and in India, most of India, will be reminded of the dampness of Blavatsky bungalow in Chennai, and get the same vibe that we always get there in our School of Wisdom classes, hearing these two speakers today. So we are studying the book by former President N. Sriram called Seeking Wisdom. And the title of the study camp is Discovering Wisdom. And every day has been enormously interesting. So today we begin our first session by Sister Linda for 45 minutes, after which we'll have a 15-minute question-answer session, a 5-minute break, and after that, Brother Pedro will follow his talk. So over to you, Sister Linda.
Thank you, Sister. One of those statements in theosophical literature, which is probably strongly engraved on the hearts of many, is listen to the song of life. Listen to the song of life. In fact, that is the motto of a TS centre in Australia. Listen to the song of life. It is situated in natural surroundings with many birds, and the sounds of nature are all around. So it was very appropriate. So today we're going to deal with chapter 10 of the text, which is called The Song of Life, and see what Brother Sri Ram has to say this time about another facet of wisdom. So we commence. First of all, one may ask the question, what does it mean to listen? And once again, I'm going to bring up slides for us to look at. What does it mean to listen? This statement, of course, does not only apply to our sense of hearing. We may hear sounds, but we may not, in fact, really be listening. So Brother Sri Ram spoke of listening as a means, as meaning a condition of receptivity to the true nature of things, to that truth that will then unfold itself. So it's a condition, really, a state of being, a state of consciousness in which we give attention to that which is deeper so that the truth can then unfold itself. He said we must listen with our whole being, our whole heart. So often in life we think we are hearing something, we think we are listening, but in fact our mind is somewhere else as well. There is the term multitasking. Sometimes we may have a number of different things in our mind and think we are listening to something or someone, but we are not really giving them our fullest attention. So there's a distinction between simply hearing and really listening. And furthermore, we need to be in a condition of silence, I would suggest, in order to hear what life has to say. A condition in which ideas are not projected from our memory. One of the well-used examples given in the book is, or rather given generally, is the idea of a tree, which really prevents us from really listening to, experiencing that tree. We may have some mental construct of what a tree is, or what the name is of the tree that we are looking at, something like that. But in the process, we may only be really listening, as it were, superficially to the tree, not really with our deepest nature. And I'd like to share with you now a short story which is relevant to what we are considering here. The Master would often say that silence alone brought transformation, but no one could get him to define what silence was. When asked, he would laugh and then hold up his forefinger against his tightened lips, which only increased the confusion of his disciples. One day there was a breakthrough when somebody asked, "And how is one to arrive at this silence you speak of?" The Master said something so simple that the disciples studied his face for a sign that he might be joking. He wasn't, though. He said, "Wherever you may be, look when there is apparently nothing to see. Listen when all is seemingly quiet." So it's about a certain quality of listening. Look when there is apparently nothing to see. So look deeply. Use your inner senses. Listen when all is seemingly quiet. Because within quiet, there is a vibration, which we might call a sound, but something is there, and we may miss it if we are not careful. Krishnaji said, "Have you ever sat very silently, not with your attention fixed on anything, not making an effort to concentrate, but with the mind very quiet, really still? Then you hear everything, don't you? You hear the far off noises, as well as those that are nearer and those which are close by, the immediate sounds, which means really that you are listening to everything. Your mind is not confined to one narrow channel. If you can listen this way," he said, "listen with ease, without strain, you will find an extraordinary change taking place within you, a change that comes without your volition, that is, without your will, without your asking. And in that change, there is great beauty and depth of insight." So he was talking about really sitting quietly and listening to everything. But within that noise, if you like, there can come about a change, an experience of beauty and depth of insight, of that which is behind that noise, behind those sounds. So one can go very deeply into this and have an amazing experience depending on one's state of consciousness and one's state of attention. So if you really listen then in silence, you can be listening to everything, but also go to the heart of it. Often we are selective. We might pick up more consciously sounds which we happen to like, or sounds which we particularly dislike. On the other hand, we kind of ignore, we push them to one side. But in order to really listen, we have to transcend this tendency to prefer certain sounds and to push away other sounds. In other words, there needs to be a certain vairagya, if you like, a certain dispassion, to be in a state in which sounds do not pull us one way or another, but we can just be silent in the midst of whatever sounds there are, without filtering them, if you like. So now we're going to talk to the subject of life itself. A little further on in the text, Brother Sri Ram mentions that the word life can be used in two senses. First of all that is external which happens to us. And secondly, the flowing stream of life, its movement through and within every living creature. So there's this external life. We can feel that around us. Quite often we feel separate from us, and feel things are separate from us, but also it is possible to actually get in touch with the life within what is around us as well. Again, depending on whether we are receptive, whether we are really conscious of life's unity, whether we are in harmony at that moment. So these are two ways of considering life, according to him. So part of our challenge is to be able to move our consciousness freely and easily between external and a more internal kind of awareness. So we have this totality of external sounds and incidents, but we also have this real inner sense of life. One way of describing this using more technical theosophical terms is that the antakarana needs to be open. And remember, in a previous session, we had the image of the mind as being depicted by two cones, and the point of each cone was just sort of touching the other point. But the possibility within this, that opening between the two aspects of the mind could become clearer and wider and absorb more what is coming from within. Let us move on to another quotation, which will be familiar with you, no doubt. Brother Sri Ram quoted one of these wonderful statements from Light on the Path: regard earnestly all the life that surrounds you. Regard earnestly. To be earnest is to be keen or to have real intent. So pay attention, really attend to the life around you. So we have this sense of observing, of watching, of witnessing, and really being with the life around us. We can think of the importance of the consciousness being able to move freely and easily between external awareness and internal awareness. Life is movement. Life is vibration. We can see this in so many different ways. Listening to the song of life means becoming more sensitive, more aware of the vibrations behind life's movements, more aware of the inwardness of things, if you like. But often noise gets in the way. I'm going to share another little story about noise. Each day the master would be inundated with questions that he would reply to seriously, playfully, gently, firmly. One disciple always sat through each session in silence. When someone questioned her about it, she said, "I hardly hear a word he says. I am too distracted by his silence." So there is something extraordinary which can happen to one's consciousness when one sits in silence. And for this disciple, it was just really being in the presence of this master, which was particularly significant to her, and rather than the words that were spoken. Let us continue. In connection with the life within, we may do well to examine for a few minutes another phrase, and that is the one I mentioned before, the voice of the silence, which of course is the title of that very well-known little theosophical text. A former General Secretary of the Australian section of the Theosophical Society, Helen Zahara, made a number of observations which I'm going to share with you about the voice of the silence and what that might mean. She observed that this voice takes different forms, and I think we can find this out for ourselves as well. First of all, an inner compulsion or guidance towards taking a particular action. So this strong feeling from within about taking a particular action. But then we have to ask ourselves, is this a genuine spiritual impulse? And it is only with the dawning of the ability to really discern that we can find out whether this is just an impulse or whether it is something deeper. Then again, she said, we can consider another inner voice to be that of conscience, which determines the extent of our morality, really. True conscience, I would suggest, comes from deeper within us and really, if you like, comes from the realm of the spirit. But what we think of as conscience may have an external origin because that is produced by society. So society may have its own moral codes or whatever. One's own conscience may not necessarily always align with those codes of society. So conscience is something that really arises more and more as one becomes more aware of life and has a real interest in unfolding the spiritual nature. It is inevitable as part of that conscience will become more prominent as we go along. Then Miss Zahara wrote of a strong thought, almost like a voice speaking to us. And probably everybody here has experienced that. Sometimes there is this very strong thought in our mind, which can be in one kind of level, if you like, of this voice of the silence. Again, we need to determine the source of this to know whether it is a true manifestation of this voice. Then she spoke also of an inner voice. She said the mystic state seems to be one of interior illumination, a flood of inner light and joy, a tremendous sense of unity. So this is another kind of voice. And for those who meditate regularly, there may be moments like this when all of a sudden there is this flood of something which wells up, a light, an energy, a joy from within. So this is one way also of understanding the voice of the silence as a deeper manifestation of that. So these provide some intimations of what the voice of the silence means. How might we describe this in perhaps some more familiar theosophical terms? Well, Brother C.W. Leadbeater said that the voice of the silence for anyone is that which comes from the part of himself which is higher than his normal consciousness can reach. Therefore, it is logical and natural that this voice is going to change as the evolution of that individual proceeds. And these changes may be considered, in fact, in several stages. Firstly, for those who are focused in the personality, that voice may originate in the subtler aspects of the mind, in which there is a synthesizing and conceptual quality of comprehension. So the subtler aspects of the mind. But for someone who is more sensitive again, that voice might be the voice of buddhi, which provides an illumined understanding. So it could be a voice of that unitive aspect of us, that beautiful light within, which helps to irradiate the mind. Or eventually that voice would come from the level of Atma, and then we could regard that voice even as spiritual will. So these are some ways of understanding the voice of the silence. And I'm sure this list is not exhaustive, but that experience will present itself differently to different individuals, without a doubt. And no doubt also when the level of adeptship is reached in human evolution, then there will be still subtler expressions of this voice. Let us move on with the text. Brother Sri Ram had something to say about our relationship with life. He said, being in its midst, that is, being in the middle of life, we must become aware of our relationship with it. We must become aware of our relationship with life. And this really poses the question, well, what is relationship in that case? The word comes from a Latin root meaning bring back. And therefore, we could suggest that in true relationship, we become aware of, we are brought back to our essential bond with all of life. In authentic relationship, we are brought back to that bond with life. But one could add that the theory has to melt into practice. Our bond with all life is felt inwardly and not outwardly. And so that bond also in turn needs to become expressed in the midst of our relationships in everyday life as well. Brother Sri Ram mentioned that when we are open to it, our own living is no longer an isolated affair, and there's a feeling of space within our own being, an expanding movement which includes all others. So there is this essential bond with life and a feeling of space within our own being, which arises from that, and then an expansion outwards to include others. But he comments that we live in a condition of being shut in. So this is a contrast to that expansion. Perhaps because we are self-limiting, we tend to live in our relatively small worlds, in our immediate orbit, in everyday life, but tend not to reach out so much. Our feeling for persons or things is not genuine, but it springs from our personal likes and dislikes. He said there is a mentality of using and exploiting everything that comes within our scope, spurred on by the appetite for more and more sensation. There is much truth of that, really, because when we think about the world and how people live in the world, there is much exploitation that goes on in so many, many ways. And this appetite for sensation is so patently present, and it's fed very much by all of the media which sort of reach out to us on a daily basis as well. So we have to decide how we're going to live within that kind of environment. He talked about, for example, our treatment of animals as well when it comes to exploitation. Exploitation is to use something or another being for one's own ends, deriving some sort of benefit at the expense of something else. And it's bred globally in a mental atmosphere which places great value on competition and satisfying our desires, no matter what. So exploitation or getting benefit at the expense of something else is so incredibly common. And of course, Dr. Besant wrote about this turning point when instead of giving and grasping, grasping and taking, there comes a point in evolution when we realize that there is something more significant in life and start to give back more and more. And that's a very important point, really, to actually come to that realization that it's important to have gratitude for what we have, gratitude for the life around us, gratitude for the opportunities in a life, and to give back as a result of that. Gratitude for this wonderful planet on which we live. But perhaps many people are not like that. They see the earth, they see the life around them more in monetary terms and how they can use it, instead of having this sense of the sacred in everything, which really helps to encourage a completely different way of seeing and acting in the world. Brother Sri Ram wrote that every living thing lives for the enjoyment of its life, its movements, and not for our gratification. Everything lives for the enjoyment of its life. If one really looks around, it's amazing sometimes how we can find other life forms that need help. For example, even a little insect in trouble. If our eyes are open, if we are aware, if we consider such life forms to be sufficiently important, then we will see in a different way. We will act in a different way. We move on now. Another feature of exploitation derives from what has been described as an instrumental treatment of life. For example, the eco-philosopher Dr. Henryk Skolimowski, who passed away not so long ago, wrote a paper in which he commented that we need to change the whole structure of our consciousness, which is programmed towards manipulation and mechanistic thinking, resulting in an instrumental treatment of people and nature. So we needed to, according to him, to change the whole structure of our consciousness and stop treating others for our own ends, for our own benefits. So we have to do the work, really. No one else can change our consciousness for us. For many people, this may involve adopting a vegetarian diet, some form of vegetarian diet, for example. So this is a very important thing, really. What are we focused on? How do we treat others? Do we treat them for ourselves at times or quite often? Or do we treat them in a different way? Our programming or our conditioning runs deep, and its many facets are easy to identify, or rather not easy to identify, let alone to change. For many individuals with emerging spiritual awareness, even a partial reorientation of their consciousness away from self-absorption involves challenges, all sorts of challenges. Some people may disagree even with Dr. Skolimowski's previous comment, affirming that it is not necessary to change ourselves in such a radical way, but it is worthwhile considering. And the most important thing that we can do if we're considering this is to look at ourselves and to look at how we treat others. He also said it is not sufficient nowadays to care for yourself and your personal spiritual well-being, or even that of your religious community, you must extend this care to the entire earth. And I think given the dramatic changes in climate that we have now on this planet, perhaps more and more people are starting to turn their attention to this care for the earth because of various circumstances. And Dr. Skolomovsky said that this earth is your dwelling, your temple, your sangha, your vessel in which spiritual attainments can be perfected on your way to bodhisattvahood and Buddhahood. So he sees, or saw rather, earth as our temple, which is a rather beautiful way of thinking about it. He also spoke about what he called the Dharma of our time. The Dharma of ecological philosophy, he said, in a nutshell, is singing the right song with the unfolding universe, which is beautiful but fraught with dangers and pitfalls. So we may stumble if we're not careful. He wrote, may we have enough courage to bear the light that is required of us to make the universe luminous and kind. So an interesting approach. He talked about a certain dharma of our time, an imperative of our time, a duty of our time, singing the right song with the unfolding universe. So again, this song of life motif comes up again in what he wrote. He continued by saying that when there is no feeling for life in general, there can be no feeling for our fellow human beings, and that makes sense. A central subject in spiritual living is then brought up, and that is motive. Motive. One of the Mahatmas said, motive for us is everything. Motive is everything. That which springs from a motive of self-indulgence or self-protection or self-advancement is not real feeling. And that is a feeling for life in general. So motive is important. In this connection, a number of you will be familiar with the book by Mr. Rohit Mehta, The Creative Silence, which was a commentary on the voice of the silence. He wrote, to be aware of the patterns of projection is to deal with the conscious mind, but to inquire into the motives of projections is to delve into the unconscious layers of the mind. And this is true enough. Our motives may often be unconscious to us, not that clear, but sometimes we really need to look at the mind with a searchlight, as it were, to discover what our motives are. To continue, the real meaning of life, wrote Brother Sri Ram, nowadays is a favourite question mostly left unanswered. So probably many people may occasionally use the phrase, what is the meaning of life, or think about it a little bit, but not really go into it. And maybe it's just too difficult for them to even really think about, to comprehend. We need a sense of meaning and purpose, or else life does seem rather pointless. An Australian biologist, or in fact, I think he was from New Zealand originally, but he lived in Australia, called Charles Birch, wrote a book called On Purpose. And he observed that without purpose, our lives wither. Without purpose, our lives wither. And I think that's a very important thing. And I think also as people get older, for them, purpose is particularly important. Otherwise, their life doesn't seem to have a great deal of meaning. So a question we may each ask ourselves is, what gives meaning to my life? What actually gives meaning to my life? What makes it worthwhile? What is significant? What is really important? Brother Sri Ram also wrote, only as the self of separateness fades away into inaction or dies out altogether, does the mind lend itself to life's purpose as a wholly pliable, that is moldable and sensitive instrument. Therefore, we can deduce that the effectiveness of our minds is directly proportional to the strength of the nature of ourselves, really, to our strength, really. So, but that self of separateness needs to fade away so that we become more and more aware of and responsive to the one life. And therefore, writes Brother Sri Ram, when Light on the Path says, learn to look intelligently into the hearts of men, this implies looking with pure interest rather than with curiosity, with suspicion, and so forth. The life that flows from within, he said, expresses itself in varying degrees as interest, as attention, as awareness, and so forth. And its tendency when in freedom is to create a form of harmony or beauty. Let's continue on a little bit now. He wrote that life wells up from an unknown substratum, that there is something behind life from which life emerges, if you like. And he mentions the word Akasha. Akasha can be described as in various ways. In the Theosophical glossary, we read of it as the subtle, supersensuous spiritual essence which pervades all space. And that it is stated in the Puranas that Akasha has but one attribute, namely sound. It's described in its mystic sense as the invisible sky. Remember, we spoke about the pure sky of intelligence in a previous session. Another meaning given to the word is brilliant, shining, and luminous. And it's also described as the medium of the higher thoughts of men, the higher thoughts of humans, the medium by which they communicate with the gods. Brother Sri Ram said that Akasha is scintillating with intelligence at every point. Every definite and positive expression of this energy, when it's unfettered, is in a form of harmony. Also, that when we have moments of pure harmony, we are in a sense engaging with Akasha. We are enabling Akasha to reveal itself through a certain purity of consciousness. So when we are in harmony, we are engaging with Akasha, that spiritual essence, which is sound itself, which is luminous, and which has this extraordinary quality, which we really are as well, but we don't necessarily realize it. Now we move to unity and the song of every living thing. We read in the text that the nature of the unity that exists in life seeks to expand into a harmony both in the cosmos as a whole and in each individual being. So that unity that is in life seeks to expand, it doesn't contract. But quite often we might find ourselves in a state of self-contraction instead. we can think about a snake which is coiled up tightly. But as a snake opens, then more of the surface of the snake becomes open to what is around us. And there is more of a sense of expansion and opening as well. But maybe quite often we are in a relatively coiled state, as it were. We are drawn in towards ourselves. We are self-protective, and our immediate life is really very much centered just around ourselves, not moving out towards others. We read that every living thing has deep within its very nature and being a message of its own. This is life's speech, also its song, which as we listen to it, teaches us the lesson of harmony. Each living thing is indeed unique. We are each expressions of life's speech and of life's song. There are a couple of other points of particular note towards the end of this chapter. Again, Brother Sri Ram quotes Light on the Path. Regard most earnestly your own heart, for through your own heart comes the one light which can illuminate life and make clear to your eyes all things. Regard most earnestly your own heart. When heart and mind are fused, even momentarily, then the light which enfolds mind can shine in its fullness, and it is quite an extraordinary thing. So regard your own heart. Within that heart is that light which can open your eyes, which can illuminate what is around us. There's also another point as we get towards the end of this chapter. Again, a selection of ideas from the chapter. There is more in it, and I would really commend this text to you to really sit with and reflect upon, because there are some wonderful statements there. This says one has to have self-knowledge because it is the self which inverts every perspective, which really reverses every perspective and view, which cuts off the truth and which shuts off the light from within, which guides to truth. So one has to have self-knowledge in the sense of knowledge of what this personal self is, of what it consists. And when that understanding is there, then other things become possible. Moreover, we realize that that our likes and our dislikes, our judgments, our emotions, etc., are not ultimately so important. They become less important. We really do understand by observing them that they do not last. They are transient. There is something else deeper, which is more permanent, shall we say. And of course, the ultimate form of self-knowledge with a capital S is Atma Vidya, the highest form of spiritual knowledge, soul knowledge. And compared with the intellect and the senses, this higher knowledge causes one to know reality, to know changeless reality. And probably rather than something which one would write down as a number of points, this self-knowledge is experience. It is only attained by experience. It is an experience. HPB regarded this as the only kind of occultism that any theosophist who admires light on the path and who would be wise and unselfish ought to strive after. So in its highest form, Atma Vidya for her was the highest thing to strive after. Now we're going to go to a summary slide again and just review a number of the points which have been dealt with in this session. Firstly, what it means to listen. What it means to listen. It's not hearing in the ordinary sense. It is something else. Listening to the song of life, that beautiful phrase, listening to that vibration which is there, really behind all life forms. Regarding earnestly all the life around us. Regarding earnestly, really giving attention to the life around us. We considered different forms of the voice of the silence, what they might be, or at least some of those forms. We considered a little about relationship and about our relationship with life, and relationship really being something that helps to bond us with life. It's something which gives a sense of wholeness and unity as well, ultimately, when it is authentic relationship. We considered exploitation and treating life instrumentally, and approaching life in a different way, so that we really have a sense of the intrinsic worth of life around us, and not and so that we don't use life just for our own purposes. We considered a little the question of meaning. What gives meaning to life? Having a purpose in life. The possibility of engaging with Akasha when one is in pure harmony. A state of unity, which leads to expansion outwards and not contraction, with the idea that we are often in a more contracted or protective state. And also a contrast between self-knowledge in the sense of our personal self, and also self-knowledge in the sense of Atma Vidya. I'd like to finish this session with a quotation from Jocelyn Underhill, which relates to the theme, the Song of Life. I don't have the words here, but perhaps you can just listen to them. To the spiritually trained ear, there is always music waiting to be heard, and this soundless sound swells upward and onward until it unites itself with the throb of the eternal sea and the clear call of the stars, both of which are chords in the great melody of the voices of the angels of God and the sons of the morning, the music that fills the cosmos with a harmony unending and divine.
Thank you, Sister Linda. If there are any questions, kindly put them now or write them in the chat box. Mostly, I think there is so much to absorb that people are going to go back to seeing the video on YouTube again. As I noticed, the first day has 95 views in the YouTube channel. So I think people who are in the session are also revisiting the video. So let's see if, yes, there is one question from Baswaraj Reddy. It says, he says, is it the voice of silence disclosed from the divine plan? Is it the voice of silence disclosed from the divine plan?
I wouldn't necessarily think of it as being disclosed from the divine plan, although the outworkings of what we call the divine plan may eventually cause us to apprehend the voice of the silence. We could say that the voice of the silence ultimately, in a deeper way, really comes from the divine, rather than the divine plan itself. The idea of a plan gives a sense of, I guess, the long-term evolution of humanity and the whole creative process and various things that are going to happen in evolution. But that voice of the silence ultimately does come from deep within. And I think our divine nature, it's there in our divine nature, but we need to uncover that voice of the silence. I was thinking also about the question of noise. I mentioned Krishnaji before, talking about listening to everything around you and all of that. But one of the greatest impediments for us to experience this voice of the silence at a more deep level is our own noise. We may carry a lot of noise within us with the emotions and the mind, much noise from that, which gets in the way of, remember we were talking about clouds of our nature. Sri Ram was talking about clouds of our nature and how that consists of emotions and memories and things like that. And I would add to that anticipations also. If those things can all be dropped, if that noise can all be dropped, then we become open to something profound, something beautiful, some very lofty vibrations. This, of course, needs to be accompanied by, I guess, what we could call a developing spiritual nature and a dedication to living a certain kind of life with a certain level of simplicity and not excessive emphasis on the material. And when we create certain conditions around us with the way we live, and we are able to, at least momentarily sometimes, allow that noise to subside, then it is possible to receive these intimations of the divine, I would suggest, that voice of the silence, so-called.
Thank you, sister. Anyone else would like to ask any question? Please unmute yourself and ask the question.
One more question is whether awareness is possible without consciousness.
Whether awareness is possible without consciousness. Asked by Baswaraj again.
One of the fundamental theosophical teachings is that consciousness is primary, that consciousness is everywhere in manifestation. Therefore, if consciousness is always there, then awareness needs to take place within consciousness. I don't think it is possible to be aware without having consciousness in any case. But I think that really suggests that there is this ultimate intelligence in the universe, if you like. That is always there. We are aspects of this one thing in the universe, of this unity. We are conscious aspects of that unity. And therefore, to have any level of awareness at all, there also needs to be consciousness. That is how I understand it.
Okay, thank you, sister.
Is there anyone else?
These thoughts in these chapters are, some of them really invite a great deal of reflection. And it may be a good thing that there are not so many questions, because I would say it means that people are really taking this within and just working with it. And I think that's really the nature of a book such as this, Seeking Wisdom, something for one to really reflect on and go into, rather than, I guess, too readily coming up with opinions and comments and that sort of thing. These are things that need to be sat with in the deeper aspect of our mind. And if we are open, we'll find new insights as well as we go along. And whenever there is true wisdom, then when one comes to that with an open mind, one can see new facets of that wisdom when one comes back to even the same concept. Over a period of time, new realizations are likely to emerge.
Is it not true that when we go into the dreamless sleep, total turiya, is that sort of the right voice of silence? During the sleep, we don't have dreams, we don't have anything. It's absolutely, we are in it, but this is the real voice of silence.
That's probably another way of thinking about the voice of the silence. I think, as I said before, when I was sharing with you some thoughts about the voice of the silence by Miss Helen Zahara and Mr. C.W. Leadbeater as well, these are some perspectives on it, but we can think of it in different ways. And I think that's a very valid way to consider it as well, as being in a state of dreamless sleep, when we are really deeply in a deep state of consciousness. That may be there too. Yes.
Thank you.
Can I add a few words about it? This is actually deep sleep is an unconscious state of body, but voice of silence is a conscious activity. That is the major difference I feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the deep sleep, I suppose, in a way, it depends on whether you take it as literally being asleep or as being a deep state of consciousness, or almost like a meditative consciousness. If you think of it more as a deep state of meditative consciousness, then it's not so unconscious in that way. And maybe if we think of that being in deep sleep as being partly something we can take as literally a fact or literally true, but also as pointing to something else as a deep consciousness, then it still sits quite well in that context.
So I think we can end our first session now and take our 5-minute break.
Yes, in this break period, we have a music from a very good student of Theosophy. She is a classical music singer, a student of Manju Sundaram. I am playing that.
कौन गली गए श्याम श्याम रे कौन गली गए श्याम बता दे सखी कौन गली गए श्याम श्याम कौन गली
Yes.
Welcome back, everybody, to the second session of the day 5. And we have already covered one chapter which looked extremely hard to understand. Let's hope that Brother Pedro makes the next chapter easier also for us. Thank you, and please join us, Brother Pedro.
Hello. If you found the previous chapter hard, this one, then we better give up, because he goes very deep into the matter of spirituality in daily life. Yes, good morning to you all. In chapter 11 of the book Seeking Wisdom, Mr. Sri Ram, the title of this chapter is The Most Beautiful State of Mind and Heart. He will examine what happens to a human being, to a student of the ancient wisdom, or a practitioner, if you like, or a sadhaka. What happens when the practice of that person truly flowers? Not only intellectually, it's easier to accumulate information about such subjects, but in a real sense. For example, he begins by saying that it would be a most interesting exercise for any of us to consider as deeply as we can the question, what is the most desirable state of mind and heart to be in? The yoga philosophy suggests that our consciousness and our minds, they are affected by vrittis, by modifications or disturbances. For example, whenever there is a sharp difference of opinion between two people, or something even stronger than difference of opinion, a clash of views, the ripples from that clash will last for quite some time. I have known people in my own country that had such a clash and never spoke to each other until they died, which means this account will have to be settled in a future incarnation or incarnations. And this is very common. So our state of mind and heart is continuously affected by our mental ripples or disturbances, emotional disturbances, and so on. And what is called sadhana is this approach or activity that seeks to establish a basis of stability from which we can proceed. I remember many years ago at Adyar, Radhaji in one of her talks saying that the path proper only begins when you realize that the personal self is not real. As long as you assume or believe that the personal self is real, you are not on the path. This is what the great traditions also say, including the little book at the feet of the master, because the emphasis of that little book is a life which is not self-centered, but other-centered. We use our faculties, whatever faculties we may have, we use our gifts of understanding and compassion and so on to help others. And we don't remain encircled within ourselves. So that was his question. What is the most desirable state of mind and heart to be in? And then he says, for until we arrive at a certain internal state in which there is a sense of freedom as well as harmony and a spontaneous outflow of life and joy, we cannot help being discontented and restless. It has been said that we can observe the self, the personal self, by its manifestation in our mind and in our consciousness. Whenever there is discontent, there is the self. Whenever there is jealousy, there is the self. Whenever there is resentment, there is the self. The problem is that many people don't see that as a problem. But if these reactions are allowed to continue indefinitely, they will grow in strength and they will mold, condition, and shape our entire lives. I was privileged to be Radhaji's translator at an interview in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, during the World Congress of 1993. And the journalist who conducted the interview, in the beginning, he wanted, as some journalists use that jargon, he wanted to break the ice. In other words, he wanted to make her feel comfortable. So he asked the question, can you tell me something about yourself? Can you share with us something about yourself? As you know, I have this little hypothesis or theory that whenever you ask a person who has found wisdom a question, you have to be prepared for a very real challenge, which I call self-demolition, because the wise person's mind functions in different parameters. So Radhaji looked at him and she said, I am one of the very few persons in the world who is very interested in find out what the self is. This poor man, he had no reaction to that. He didn't know what to say. So he decided to start the interview. But this is important. The self in us, we don't think the self in us is dangerous. But every flare-up of the self produces ruptures in relationships. Entire families suffer. Your work environment suffers. Your relationship with your close one suffers. And I think the Buddha created this masterful metaphor about the self. He said, and this is not a public discourse, this is an instruction to his disciples. He said, there is this man who is content. He has a family whom he loves. He has his little rural property, which he likes, with some animals and servants and so on. This was 25 centuries ago in North India. And he is very happy with his life. One night, very late at night, in the middle of the night, he hears knocks on his door, and he goes to the door, and when he opens it, there is this stranger, weary, tired, dusty. And the stranger says to him, I have been traveling for many days. I'm very hungry and tired. If you could allow me to stay in some quarters here, and if you could give me a little bit of food, I'll depart next morning. So the householder looked at him and decided to give him accommodation for one night and managed to give him some food. In the next morning, the family of the householder met the stranger and they liked him. So the householder noticed that and allowed him to stay for another night for 3 more nights, a week, 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months, indefinitely. After that, one night, very late at night, the stranger walked into the householder's bedroom with a knife and killed him. And the Buddha said, the stranger is the self. We have welcomed this creature into our lives. We feed it, we give it accommodation. And what is the self? This deeply ingrained notion that we are separate and that we exist to nurture that separation, to maintain it at all costs. And anybody who challenges that separation or the self has to meet with our opposition, aggression, and sometimes violence. And yet, we indulge in horse trading with the self. We'll say, yes, I did flare up, I lost my temper, but who doesn't? Then it will happen again and again. And the spiritual traditions, the genuine spiritual traditions address that. That's the core of the practice. Some modern teachers seem to believe that if you believe in them, you don't need to do any work. You just surrender your will to them. That's not how it works. The Buddha never did that. He told the disciples, be a lamp unto yourselves, which means find clarity in yourselves, reliance in yourselves, not dependency. Dependency is not only bad, it corrodes the will, which is necessary for us to tread the path. So, Mr. Sri Ram said that until we arrive at a certain inner state in which there is a sense of freedom as well as harmony and a spontaneous outflow of life and joy, we cannot help being discontented and restless. Why? Because this is what the uneducated mind does. It enjoys being discontented. It derives a certain pleasure from that. Mr. Leadbeater would say in his language and in his books that the mind elemental thrives on discontent, thrives on self-will, self-centeredness. And yet we normally don't see that. Brother Sri Ram continues, these qualities have each its particular beauty, and they may therefore seem distinct and different, but they all arise from one underlying condition and melted into one another ultimately. In another book, he will say, the ground of all these virtues, the ground of all these qualities is humility. And there is a definition of humility in a Christian mystical treatise called The Cloud of Unknowing, which is very effective and very practical and very true. According to that text, humility is to see ourselves as we are. We don't lie to ourselves. We look at ourselves. We look at our faults and we learn from them. Brother Sri Ram later on will say also that there is no point in self-commiseration and saying that, oh, I am a failure and this and that and the other, because this is another activity of the self. Self-pity, by definition, is a sense of pity created by ourselves. It doesn't help. And then he says that when there is this most beautiful state of being, there is simultaneously a feeling of peace or rest and free spontaneous movement. That means only in such a condition the mind can be truly creative, because it's not impeded by self-pity, self-importance, self-concern, and so on. But at the same time, there is a feeling of peace. In the little book called Practical Occultism, Madame Blavatsky mentions that the door through which God or the divine enters the soul is called contentment. This is a very powerful statement. She knew what she was saying. Contentment is very important, because contentment means that the mind has reached some degree of maturity. It has ceased to blame the circumstances and others. It has ceased to blame itself also in a way in terms of self-pity, but it accepts circumstances as they are and does not allow the circumstances to dominate it. So it is free to proceed in this path of awareness. Brother Shriram says, we must all have experience in ourselves or notice in others a condition that cannot stay self-contained, but must trust itself on others. When one does not know what to do with himself or herself, he automatically pushes himself on someone else. This is a common experience. If an individual is frustrated, he's going to download that frustration on others. Why? Because he or she is not aware about the energy of frustration, the accumulated frustration or discontent. But the others are not to blame. To quote Radhaji again, she wrote in one of her articles in the Theosophist, she was knowledgeable the Shakespearean plays. She mentioned the play about Othello, the Moor of Venice. What was his problem? Irritability, anger. He was convinced that his wife was betraying him. There was no actual betrayal, but he was convinced. And there is another character that could be interpreted as an extension of his mind, Iago, who incited him to act and to try to convince him that he was being betrayed. And he had outbursts and he would yell and so on at his wife. And Radhaji said, we have to look at Othello and understand that when he's yelling and he's conducting outbursts at others and threatening others, and this applies not only to Othello, but to every one of us, when Othello is doing all that, he's actually saying through those actions, help me, I'm lost. I have lost my way. He was actually seeking help. This is what the bullies of this world are doing. Of course, in the meantime, they are causing tremendous suffering, and they have to be held responsible by the law, by the suffering that they cause. But psychologically, this is what's happening. If they have found contentment in themselves, they wouldn't hurt others, mock others. There are young students who do that. And they probably will grow up doing that or doing other things because they are not aware of what is happening within them. Brother Sri Ram continues, we must all have experienced, I have mentioned that. He said, the peace that arises from the very mode of one's life and action is a deep feeling that springs from within and permeates one's whole being, in the very midst of movements so harmonized that there is no break in the harmony of unity of that being. So it's a deep realization. And the TS, from its very inception, has been encouraging the study, but it also has been encouraging the practice of meditation. There are articles on meditation from the very few issues of magazines like The Theosophist and Lucifer and so on. And the practice of meditation leads to this sense of peace, to this sense of calm. But as Dr. Annie Besant said, there is no point trying to practice a little bit now and only come back to it several weeks later, because the patterns of the self will strengthen themselves during this period of non-practice. And probably this is the reason why in the Bhagavad Gita, while answering the question of Arjuna about the difficulty of controlling the mind, Sri Krishna says, yes, the mind is difficult to control, but it can be controlled by abhyas and vairagya. That means practice, daily practice, and detachment. This detachment has to include the detachment of expectations about the progress of the practice. This is another contemporary problem. I have known people who have jumped, hopped from one meditation practice to another throughout their lives. They could never settle. They claimed that none of the previous ones was effective for them. But probably they never really understood what meditation is. Whenever there is this deep feeling that Brother Sri Ram mentions, there is contentment and there is harmony. Actually, one of the definitions of yoga is harmony. The capacity to end reactions, for example, to end expectations, to end reminiscences. One of the great Buddhist philosophers of the 2nd century, Nagarjuna, he taught that. And he had very complicated teachings. They were not teachings for beginners. But he suggested in one of his teachings, treatises, that all things are empty. Of course, some of the Orientalists that first contacted this called him a nihilist because he didn't see anything. So I discussed a little bit about this with Radha Ji, and she said, yes, people may not understand the concept of shunyata, emptiness. But she said, these great authors, for them, emptiness may meant that the mind is empty from everything that it thought it knew, and it becomes open, receptive to the unknown, which comes from the spirit. He continues, Brother Sri Ram, saying that in this kind of state of mind, in this fresh mind, there is a quality of resonance which communicates the vibrations to any medium that is capable of being stirred by them. So, if there is this quality of harmony, of peace or contentment, it spreads to everything we do. And in Brother Sri Ram's case, this was completely true about his daily life. That's why he was able to impress so many people without making any effort to impress them. I was told by Sri S.S. Varma, who was a distinguished member of the Indian section, that Brother Sri Ram was accompanying Brother Surendra Narayan's father in a train station, and a passerby looked at him and came to Brother Surendra Narayan's father and asked the question, "Is he a saint?" That was the impression that he caused on that man. A condition of peace that is alive within oneself is compatible only with the quality of the finely tuned string. I'll repeat this. A condition of peace that is alive within oneself is compatible only with the quality of the finely tuned string. He uses the metaphor of the instrument. Pythagoras, it is said, according to the tradition, he was able to heal disturbed individuals that lived with conflicts and so on, by music therapy. What did he do? He would play acoustic instrument next to them, because he said that the harmony of an acoustic instrument creates a resonance with the soul of that individual and helps him to regain that soul knowledge and therefore restore harmony in his nature. Then he passes into the area of relationships. Freedom in relationship means that while one has a living relationship to all things around him, he doesn't allow them to turn the wheels of his being mechanically, and his own action upon them is not a reaction, but a free expression of the nature of his inner being. In such relationship, there can be both freedom in oneself and intimacy of contact with others. So a yogi, if you like, or a real theosophist, and Madame Blavatsky, as we have seen, said that it is easy to become a theosophy, but when you go into the qualifications, it's not very easy at all, because it implies a mind that is devoted to wisdom, to goodness, to service, without any self-concern. He is suggesting here that this individual who has found peace, harmony, and contentment, he has a living relationship with all things. In his book, Thoughts for Aspirants, he said, most of our relationships are like filaments that carry no electric current, because we are too self-absorbed. We don't really dedicate ourselves to those relationships. And one of the first steps in nourishing a relationship is to listen. To listen at a real level, to pay attention. And this involves a certain commitment in daily life. If someone comes to you with a problem, you drop everything and listen. And if you listen, listening itself may be a form of help, but if you listen and if you have something to contribute, you share that. But first of all, you listen. And he says that such relationships, in such relationships, there can be both freedom in oneself, a sense of freedom, of self-discovery, which is new, and a sense of intimacy of contact of others. Of course, if you are able to listen, if you are really able to listen, listening naturally transforms itself in helpfulness. And there are a lot of people in need of help in the world. I need to be aware of the time. Next, he still dwells on this condition of peace. He said, this condition of peace does not inhibit action in relation to others, but gives rise to action that is self-initiated and is spontaneous and is an expression of the intelligence and harmony present in that condition. We have had in the TS, in the leaders of the TS and some other distinguished members, individuals who display that. Normally we mention HPB, for example, or Annie Besant, Colonel Olcott as well. He used to travel in great inconvenience to himself in a bullock cart. In those days, I have to tell you, there were no mosquito repellents that we know of. And he traveled through many parts of India in a bullock cart, founding lodges and so on. There is an incident involving HPB in which she was about to depart on a ship from the French port Le Havre to go to the New York, and which would eventually meet Colonel Olcott and form the society. When she met this mother with her son, with her boy, she was in tears because a man who promised her to upgrade her ticket, he swindled her and he disappeared with the money. So Madame Blavatsky went straight to the ticket office and exchanged her own tickets to 3 tickets of steerage class. She didn't think about it. It was necessary. Another example, there was a Theosophical conference in London in the 60s. Mr. John Coates was the president of the European Federation of the TS. One of the guest speakers was Mr. James Perkison from the US, who later became vice president. He took ill in the middle of the night. He was quite in pain. So somebody called an ambulance, and he said that somehow John Coates knew that he was not well. He found John Coates in the same ambulance on the way to the hospital, and he laid hands on his stomach or whatever affected area there was, and he could feel these waves of healing energy coming into him very quietly. So there are many, many ways of helping. Then he mentions the word vairagya, which is a very well-known word in theosophical literature. It is there in The Voice of the Silence, At the Feet of the Master, and many, many other books. Sometimes he says it's translated as dispassion or non-attachment, or indifference to pleasure and pain, desirelessness. And then he suggested that when there is this condition in oneself, one's relationship with all things changes completely. And then why? He said, because to be attached is like a blind instinct. And he said, when one realizes the nature of this attachment or bondage, he realizes also a condition of non-acquisitiveness. So vairagya could be understood like this. It is such a maturity of mind and consciousness that there is no desire to acquire or to maintain or to dominate others. We give others complete freedom to live their lives. And out of this state of freedom from attachment, we continue to help. And this is pure sadhana. And then he also mentions that one of the 5 precepts of the Buddha, accepted by all Buddhists, is non-appropriation of anything that doesn't rightfully belong to oneself. And he goes into certain details here, saying that this does not apply only to property, this also applies to ideas, and the tendency of the mind to appropriate has to be, one has to be aware of it and not fall into the trap of appropriating what is not ours. He said, what does not rightfully belong to one need not to be only property. One may take credit for something really due to another, or which has only come about through circumstances. So again, we have another tentacle of the personal self. No wonder that in the Greek mythology, the personal self sometimes would be depicted as a monster with many tentacles. In the language of Light on the Path, as the giant weed that grows through the ages. And this sense of self grows because there is no awareness. If there is sustained awareness, sincere, daily, then this sense of self is bound to weaken. And if it's weakened, then it gives way to awareness, to listening, to service. He said, the truly spiritual individual does not in reality, that is in his or her heart, possess anything at all. And then he gave an example that he said, Dr. Besant was very fond of this example. And that is that the Indian king Janaka, who was a follower of the spiritual path, one day he found one of his palaces burning. He was unperturbed and said, nothing of mine is burning. Nothing of mine is burning. So this is an individual that attained a real degree of vairagya. Then he says, regarding possessions, it's not that we should avoid having possessions, material possessions. It would be a very unreal hope or unreal notion. He said, one receives the possessions from karma, which distributes responsibilities according to the past deeds of all concerned, but how right one is in dealing with his possessions depends very much on how free one is of attachment to them. So that's the question of right relationship means right relationship with everything, with other people, with animals, with possessions and concepts and so on. Finally, he says, Vairagya is not the antithesis of love, but a complete cleansing of oneself and a preparation for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Pedro. I think you did make it very easy for us.
I don't know.
Yes. Anybody would like to ask anything?
They are all in Sushupti.
Looks like it's all. They don't want to reify themselves by asking a question.
Sir, is it the life that is self with modification of mind and the freedom from that modification?
Sir, could you please repeat your question?
The life which makes matter by the mind modification, and then if it wipes out all these modifications, that is a life beginning and a life end.
Can you interpret this question to me, please? Because either because of the accent or
He's
talking about, yes?
He's making a statement and asking whether the statement is right, true or not. His statement is life is a modification of various disturbances. So when the modifications are not there, it is connected to that statement, yoga chitta vritti nirodha. So I think he's saying that if there are no modifications, then we experience true life. Is he right or wrong? He's asking.
Yes. Well, that is the word life is a very rich word in many meanings and many dimensions. Even a person who is in samsara, and we're all in samsara. I actually look it up in the dictionary, and one of the definitions of samsara is aimless wandering. That means you don't know what you are going. You are still alive, you still have a personal life, but you don't know what you are going. This is samsara. But to make things even more complicated, Nagarjuna says that nirvana is samsara and samsara is nirvana, which means this other life that these great teachers have spoken is here. And we are stuck in an individual life, and we don't see that. I suppose that the reason why sadhana is recommended is because it will teach us to look at ourselves, diminish all these disturbances and ripples, and then begin towards reality. Some texts suggest that the true life is only realized when there is complete moksha or nirvana. But how many people achieve that in one cycle of life? Probably very few. So the Christian tradition has a very practical approach. That's in the view of St. Paul. He said, you are the temple, your body is the temple of God, in which abides the Spirit of God. So from a theosophical point of view, we would say, yes, we have the 7 principles. We function probably only in 3 or 4. But this life, this individual life, is the beginning to reach something more profound. Dr. Besant once said that if you remove desire from a person's life, you kill that person's evolution. Because the dharma of desire is to be transmuted into spiritual will. But that's not achieved overnight. So I would suggest that, yes, there is a much glorious life beyond the modifications of the mind, but we were given this life, and some teachers said the best way to begin this exploration is here and now, and not denying that this is completely unreal. This is just one point of view.
Thank you, brother. Anybody else? Sir, I have a question, sir, not connected to your talk, but are you working on another book now? Or what are you working on? You must be, are you planning any other project?
This is the question of a journalist. Yes, yes. The next book will be called Theosophies for All, a Peasant and Leadbeater anthology. And I hope to publish it towards the end of this year or early next year.
Nice. Great, sir. All the best.
I hope I have published a book that not many people have seen. It's called Any Peasant in India. With Dr. Agarwal. He contributed a number of chapters, and I put together all his contributions and other contents of other chapters, and then the book was published. And I understand that the Indian section published an Indian edition of this book.
Yes.
That's interesting. I don't know whether it has come to the Chennai book.
No, it depends. We have circulated to all parts of India, particularly to Law Secretary, Federation Secretary. It is for them to collect the members who are interested to get.
I think we have just now opened up now. The ADR appears to have opened up now after the pandemic. So I think now members can go and check it all out.
After reaching Banaras day after tomorrow, I will give the price of that book. If you like it, then we can supply to TPH.
I understand that the Indian section published some extra copies to be sold through the TS bookshop in Kamacha.
Yes, yes, yes. Lot of.
Yes.
During Indian Session Convention, we will display it for the public to purchase.
Okay. I think this is the end, isn't it?
Yes, sir. I think there are no more questions. So I would request Sister Mittalini to close with our ending prayer. And thank you both to Brother Pedro and Sister Linda for these wonderful sessions.
Namaste to all. Asato ma sadgamaya tamasu ma jyotirgamaya mrityurmang amrutangamaya sarve bhavantu sukhinah sarve santu niramaya sarve bhadrani paschyantu na kaschit dukhabhag bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Okay, sir, we'll meet next Friday.
Thank you.
Pradeep,
Yes, sir.
our Indian section EC meeting link have you sent? Not yet, no?
No, not yet.
Today at 2:30, no?
No, sir.